Coach Jerome here with an important message. It's been a few weeks since the gates of Icecrown Citadel opened up, and some top raiders have already got their Lich King heroic kills and invincible trophies to show off. But as the initial hype subsides, we're left with thousands of guilds smashing into the brick wall of progression. Without proper guidance, most of these guilds will risk their spirits slowly chipping away until their guilds finally disband. But I believe in you, so as your coach, I'm going to take you through the toughest obstacles in Icecrown Citadel, and I'm going to arm you with the strategies to overcome them. So let's dive deep into the ultimate ICC guild breakers. As we get into the guild breakers, we first have to talk about the dark side of raiding. If your guild is doing really well and succeeding in killing all the bosses, this won't apply to you. But if you are struggling on fights like heroic Lich King, you do risk your morale dropping and infighting as well. For a quick story here, when I used to co-run a guild in TBC, we just weren't succeeding on Lady Vash. I called out the DPS and half of them ended up quitting the raid. It was a big mistake too, because it's way too hard to refill missing slots once your core players leave. Without the ability to refill your core slots, your guild will be forced to disband. Besides possible guild disbands, if your guild is consistently failing over and over again, the core members you spent a whole year gearing up will just stop logging in entirely. As your coach, it is important to remind you why we deal with the dark side of raiding though. That's because this is the raid in Classic. A lot of people look at slaying the Lich King as the final achievement in Classic before the game turns into the retail we know today. It's also just a fantastic raid with great flow, great mechanics, and even better lore. Do you really want to miss one of the most iconic cutscenes in WoW history? There's also the Invincible mount, which still drives retail players crazy to this day. Speaking of history, Shadowmourn's probably the most iconic legendary in WoW history next to Thunder Fury and Warglaves. And Phase 4 has taken gearing to the next level with the new Tier 10 sets as well. These set bonuses are far more interesting than in past phases. If you get stuck on the progression grind, you risk missing out on some of the best moments and experiences in WoW history. Time is of the essence, especially because early gearing snowballs with things like the Tier 10 sets and the Bis Lich King weapons. Once you have Phase 4 Bis gear, it stays for the rest of the expansion. The earlier you can get key pieces like the Dislodged Foreign Object, the earlier you can start to make serious progress on fights like Heroic Lich King. If your guild keeps failing in the same places over and over again, you'll miss out on weeks of potential gear and continue to fall behind while the rest of the guild snowball. That poses serious challenges for retaining your core guild members and for recruiting new players as well. As your coach, I'm here to help you fix the biggest pitfalls your guild is currently facing. Most of these problems are easily fixable and related to raid preparation and strategies. Let's get into the 8 biggest mistakes that'll cause your guild to wipe and eventually disband. We can fix these fast, I promise. At number 8, we have non-viable raid comps. I hate to give you the bad news, but ICC is the first time we're picking the class over the player is a thing. This might seem most relevant in 10-mans, where there are only 2 tanks being brought in the Prot Paladin and the Blood DK, and then only 2 healers being brought in the Disc Priest and the Holy Paladin. It's not just a 10-man problem though, because in 25-mans there are only a few viable healer comps for fights like Lich King. Nearly all the successful heroic Lich King fights brought 3 Holy Paladins, a Resto Shaman, and a Disc Priest. Unfortunately, Paladins are just too valuable with their Divine Sacrifice and their Aura Mastery utility. And that means if you're a Resto Druid or a Holy Priest, you'll be directed straight towards the bench, which is exactly what happened to my 6200 geared Resto Druid. It's not just the healers either, because if you aren't playing one of the optimal early classes like a Death Knight or a Warlock, there just aren't a lot of raid spots for you right now. If you've ever been benched for being the wrong class during progression, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. Moving into number 7, we have add-ons and utilities. I'm hoping by now that all your raiders have at least the Thames Weak Aura pack, if not the paid Foji pack for ICC mechanics. Unfortunately, if you don't have some kind of weak aura pack at this point, your guild will have no hope of progressing past difficult fights like Putricide Heroic. Having positioning indicators for fights like Heroic Syndragosa makes these difficult fights feel a lot more like Vezek's normal mode. Also on the topic of visual indicators, a lot of guilds are struggling with Valtheria because their healers struggle and lose stacks. There is a new weak aura that I've linked below the video that'll automatically disable particle effects on that fight, making it much easier to see the floating orbs. We also should talk about timers. It wasn't obvious to me for years that the timers on the right side of your screen when you use a weak aura pack are the holy grail to raid progression. You really don't need a raid leader or a coach to call out when things will happen anymore. As long as everybody's got a weak aura pack, they'll know exactly when a new slime is coming out on Putricide or when Defile's coming out on Lich King Heroic. Moving into the 6th biggest problem that's going to cause your raid to hit a wall, it's not maximizing every raid buff and consumable. For 10-mans, that means bringing additional buffs like the Rune Scroll of Fortitude if you're missing a priest, or the Drums of the Forgotten Kings if you're missing a paladin. For both raid sizes, that also means bringing things like the Scourgebane buffs for your DPS. The Halloween candy buffs are huge as well, and they can easily be collected using the video in the top right. If you run out of candy, you can also portal level 1s from the starting zones to major cities to get unlimited foods like the Pyroblast Cinnamon Roll. We can't forget the basic buffs either, so as your coach, I highly recommend running your guild through a tool like the Combat Log Analyzer spreadsheet. With this sheet, you can easily see who's missing gems, enchants, buffs, everything. Moving into number 5, we have morale management. You might think that going overboard and getting min-max buffs isn't going to make a difference on fights like Heroic Lich King, but it's really a mindset change. If your guild is trying to turn over every possible stone to improve, you're going to keep morale high. Keeping morale high is extremely important so people don't quit the guild. One strong way to improve guild morale is to run guild 10-mans in Gamma dungeons together. That way, a failure on a fight like Heroic Lich King isn't going to be the only time your guild interacts with each other. The guild I'm in does a really good job with that, as well as having a lot of morale boosters like helping guild members get their 264 crafted items as well as free guild repairs. For number 4, all the morale boosters in the world aren't going to help if your players aren't playing their roles properly. The best way to fix improper play is with class leads. Your top performing and most passionate player just makes sure everybody else stays in line. The other option is to look at the logs of top performing players. As an example, when we were struggling on Lich King Heroic, I looked at the only 2 successful kills featuring a Resto Druid to see what they were doing differently. I was able to immediately see how their gear and their playstyle was giving them much better results. So everybody in your guild should open up Warcraft logs and go to the top performing guilds and pick a few logs to learn from. Alternatively, the WoW Analyzer tool is really cool for finding some basic mistakes like GCD uptime. Definitely check the link to the Analyzer tool below the video and subscribe if you found it useful. I've got way more cool resources to share in the future. At number 3, we have the inability to deal with bad RNG. ICC is one of the most RNG-heavy raids in recent memory. We have fights like Blood Council with random shock vortex spawns that can rip your entire raid apart, or Sourfang marks going on all your squishiest mages and being almost unhealable. There's also the Lich King Valkyr RNG, where your raid healers might be out of the fight for 20 seconds straight. Not to mention fight-breaking bugs like the Putricide Unbound Plague damage bug. This bug is causing Unbound Plague to deal much more damage than intended, which can make the fight nearly impossible. While Lich King Heroic might never be fully consistent, most random mechanics do have workarounds. For example, on Blood Council and 10-man, we started running 3 healers, which makes the RNG a lot less punishing. And on Putricide, you could do the Soulstone strat or bring extra battle reses to make sure the Unbound Plague bug doesn't kill your momentum. And of course, more gear will always help with chaos management, which leads us into point number 2. That point is that you likely don't have enough gear to hit DPS checks yet. One of the biggest guild breakers everybody's running into right now is Impatientce. Struggling to meet DPS checks on fights like Blood Queen and Putricide is causing huge frustration among guilds. But we have to remember that we have item level gear designed to kill the normal mode bosses, not heroic. It'll take several more weeks for your guild to be kitted out in 264 and 277 item level tier 10 sets. And then it'll take even more time for all your key damage dealers to get trinkets like Phylactery. Only then will you be able to easily meet DPS checks and even add healers on fights like Lich King, which will make the mechanics much more manageable. Getting into the current biggest guild breaker in ICC, Lich King is basically impossible right now in heroic mode. The thing is, Lich King Heroic really shouldn't be the biggest guild breaker right now. I mean, sure, there have been 30 guilds that successfully killed the heroic version, but this fight really isn't designed to be killed just yet. If you want to decide the entire phase is a failure because you didn't kill Lich King Heroic pre-nerf, you're going to have a miserable phase 4. Back in the day, guilds had 2 full months of gearing on normal modes before they even touched the Lich King. That means they had full tier 10 4 sets and every normal weapon and trinket that exists. Not to mention only a handful of guilds ever killed Lich King Heroic without stacking the 30% damage and health buff. That buff is coming within the next 6 weeks according to Blizzard, which shows they really don't think many guilds will have the boss on farm anytime soon. If you want to know how many bosses you should definitely have on farm now, you should check out my hardest boss list next. It'll tell you which heroic bosses everybody should be doing in ICC right now.